Hi everyone, this is lecture 3 of week 12, and again I'm going to be going very, very fast, and so you want to be keeping up with your readings from the biblical text and from Coogan. Okay. In the preceding video, we left off at a kind of happy point or a high point in Judean history when Jerusalem, survives the attack by the Assyrians. And what the survival of Judah did was that it really allowed this kind of crucial time for the scribes of Judah, probably now joined by scribes from the north, to gather their writings, their stories together, to start editing it and putting it together. Okay, and the other thing that the survival did was that it also allowed time for another superpower to rise up to take the place of Assyria. And this is the nation or the empire of Babylon. Okay, and though Babylon replacing Assyria, though it sounds kind of bad, it was in part because it was the Babylonians, not the Assyrians, that will eventually destroy the south. This is in part why what allows Israelite identity to remain intact long enough for Israel to survive exile. Okay, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Before we get to the end of Judah or the south, okay, let's first talk about the writings, okay, and in particular, the writings or the scroll that is found during the reign of King Josiah, the grandson of King Hezekiah, and who I talked about actually briefly before in another video from week 8. And Josiah really is the other important king. Some say he is the most important king of the Deuteronomistic history after David. There's a kind of debate, okay? Just to review, we are told in 2 Kings 22 through 24, and if you're confused about Josiah, I would recommend that you look back at the lecture for week 8, lecture 4, okay? But to review, we are told in 2 Kings 22-23 that Josiah, a good king, like his pious grandfather Hezekiah before him, decides to centralize worship. That is, he shuts down the worship of local shrines and centralizes worship to Jerusalem. Okay, indeed, so similar is what Josiah does to what Hezekiah did earlier, that some scholars, including myself, think that Hezekiah's account was kind of re-edited, downplayed a bit by later scribes during the time of Josiah, so that the reign of Josiah can look a little better than that of his grandfather. Okay, that is, there might be some kind of dueling or rivalrous scribal activity going on, where the work of scribes from the reign of one king is changed and edited by scribes from the reign of another subsequent king. Okay. Anywho, going forwards with the Josiah story, as part of the centralization of the cult, Josiah, we are told, decides to refurbish the temple. And we are told that in the middle of this refurbishment, that the workers find the scroll, which is read aloud to Josiah. And this is what happens afterwards. This is 2 Kings 22, verse 10 and following. Shaphan, the secretary, informed the king, the priest Hilkiah has given me a book. And Shaphan then read it aloud to the king. And when the king heard the words of the book of the law, notice what it's called, he tore his clothes. And then the king commanded the priest Hilkiah, Ahikam, son of Shaphan, Akbor, son of Micaiah, Shaphan the secretary, and the king's servant Asaiah, saying, go inquire of the Lord for me, for the people, and for all Judah concerning the words of this book that has been found. For great is the wrath of the Lord that is kindled against us, because our ancestors did not obey the words of this book to do according to all that is written concerning us. Okay. Hence, the scroll is found, and when the scroll is read aloud to the king, we are told that Josiah immediately gets, we're not told what it says, but we are told that Josiah immediately understands that God is very, very, very angry, so angry that he might immediately begin to destroy Judah, and therefore he and his entourage, he sends an entourage to go get word, basically an interpretation about the scroll from a prophet, a female prophet named Huldah. Okay, and when the entourage shows up to Huldah's house, this is what she says about the scroll and what will happen afterwards. This is in verse 16 following. Okay, thus says the Lord, I will indeed bring disaster on this place and on its inhabitants and all the words of the book that the king of Judah has read, because they have abandoned me and had made offerings to other gods, so that they have provoked me to anger with all the work of their hands, and therefore my wrath will be kindled against this place, and it will not be quenched. But ask the king of Judah who sent you to inquire of the Lord, thus shall you say to him, thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, regarding the words that you have heard, because your heart was penitent, and you humbled yourself before the Lord when you heard how I spoke against this place and against its inhabitants, that they shall become a desolation and a curse. And because you have torn your clothes and wept before me, I also have heard you, says the Lord. Therefore, I will gather you to your war ancestors, and you shall be gathered to your grave in peace. Your eyes shall not see all the disaster that I will bring onto this place. So, okay, not the best prophecy, right? So we are told that when the people in the court, this entourage, takes the scroll to the prophetess Huldah to be interpreted, right? She interprets it as a signal, of impending, undoable, fated disaster. Okay, hence. What this story does, or what Huldah's prophecy does, of course, is it forewarns the reader that Judah too, very soon, like the north, will be destroyed. Okay, she says, however, yes, God's going to destroy this place. He's not going to turn back. However, she says there's a caveat, right? We are told that because Josiah was such a good king, because he was like really upset that they found the scroll and they've been like not following God's law. Well, Josiah is going to die in peace. Okay. The problem is that none of these things that she says is going to happen or fits the story going forward. Okay. She says, okay, she just, notice how she says that this disaster is coming, that it cannot be stopped. Okay. Yet we are told in the very next chapter, 2 Kings 23, Josiah undertakes a huge reform of the cult where he tears down all these outlying cultic areas and destroys all the idols and, basically smashes everything that's not like super Yahwistic in focus, right? He also celebrates the Passover, which seems not to have been celebrated for like many years. That is, it's sure, it doesn't seem like Josiah got the message that this disaster was inevitable, because in the very next chapter, it looks like he is doing everything he can to avert disaster by reforming the religion of Judah, right? So as to what? Pacify God. So there's something weird here with the text, okay? That's not all. Also at odds with Huldah's prophecy is the way in which Josiah dies, okay? She, in her prophecy, like I said, says that Josiah, because he was such a good boy, will go to his death in peace, but that's not what happens, okay? We are told in 2 Kings 23, verse 29, this. In his days, Pharaoh Necho, king of Egypt, went up to the king of Assyria to the river Euphrates, and King Josiah went to meet him, but when Pharaoh Necho met him at Megiddo, he killed him. And his servants carried him dead in a chariot from Megiddo, brought him to Jerusalem, buried him in his own tomb. The people of the land took Jehoahaz, son of Josiah, anointed him, and made him king in place of his fathers. It states, instead, that for some unknown reasons, which scholars still debate, Josiah goes up to meet the Egyptian pharaoh and is killed there. Okay, that is, Josiah does not die in peace as Huldah's prophecy says he would. Okay, so what's going on? Okay, well, obviously, as with the story of Hezekiah, which we looked at in the last video, the story of Josiah also shows a lot of evidence of editing and redoing. Okay, so this is what scholars kind of postulate happened. Okay, in a much earlier video, again from week 8, lecture 4, remember how I discussed how scholars think that the scroll that Josiah finds, the one that's, I guess enumerates all the rules or commandments that the people of Judah had been not doing, okay, making God very, very angry. That the scroll, remember I explained in that video that this scroll, a lot of people think that this was some edition of Deuteronomy 12 through 26. Okay, and I also explained in that video that the same group who was responsible for finding and therefore likely writing the scroll of Deuteronomy, they were also likely the ones who had something to do with the putting together, the writing and the editing and the shaping of the history of Israel from Joshua to the story of Josiah in 2 Kings 22. Okay, the Deuteromistic historian. Okay, to fill out this theory a bit more, this is what scholars think might have happened. Okay, so I'm now kind of expanding what I said in that video. Scholars think that during the time of Hezekiah, so the time of Josiah's grandfather, okay, when the north falls, scholars think that, again, as I explained, the northern scribes flee into Judah, bringing with them their own northern traditions and beginning kind of a flurry of scribal activity, okay? Likely these earlier scribes, some believe, myself included, okay, composed, like I said, an earlier edition of parts of the Deuteronomistic history, okay? And likely this kind of earlier edition, a lot of people speculate that it culminated with the reign of Hezekiah, the king who these scribes were employed by, okay? That's in part why we might have such a positive and such a lengthy account of the reign of King Hezekiah, okay? When Hezekiah's die, and his grandson Josiah begins to rule, scholars think that another later group of scribes, called the Deuteronomistic Historian 1, or DTRH1, that's how it's kind of shortened, took this earlier history, right, written by Hezekian scribes, and they fluffed it up, okay, using the pretense of finding an ancient scroll, okay? And what these Josiah scribes, or Josianic scribes, did was edit the history of Israel so that it culminates with the reign of their employer, Josiah, who is depicted as the best king ever, okay? Sadly, however, Josiah suddenly dies, and probably at not the oldest age, at a pretty young age, which is not good theologically, okay? Moreover, despite Josiah's reform, Judah does eventually fall. It's destroyed not by Assyria, but a country called Babylon later in the 7th century, thus starting the exilic period, okay? And a lot of scholars think that what happened then, after Judah falls, is that a later group of scribes called the Deuteronomistic Historian 2, or DTRH2, okay, during exile, re-edit the Deuteronomistic history by putting in small hints, prophecies, foreshadows about how this exile was stated, okay, and that there was nothing anyone can do, including Josiah, to stop it from occurring. Okay, this exilic editor, DTRH2, or Deuteronomistic Historian 2, is likely the one who added in Huldah's prophecy that this exile is assured despite whatever actions Josiah takes. Okay. Speaking of exile, the reason why these later scribes had to re-edit and re-adapt the text in the Deuteronomistic history, again, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, is because, as I just stated, Judah, that is the south, is also eventually destroyed, just like the north, okay? And the destruction of the south, or Judah, is described at the very end of 2 Kings 24 and 25. And in these sad but short, very fast-paced chapters, right, you almost get the sense that the writers are kind of rushing through these events because they don't want to really tell you about the destruction of their country. We are told that the demise of the south is not a sudden event, but it happens in several stages. That's a drawn out, very painful event, okay? And basically the demise of the south consists of 3 waves of deportation by the Babylonians, okay? The Babylonians are this other country also from the area of modern-day Iraq that conquered the Assyrians and took over as the dominating empire around the 6th century, okay? So 3 waves of deportation really make up the exile and the destruction of the south. In the first deportation, the most elite people were taken into captivity in Babylon, okay? So they are basically taking off or removing the people that are most likely the leaders, those who would promote rebellions, okay? And also those who the Babylonians thought would be really useful in their empire. Really the creme de la creme of, Judean society are taken. Okay. The king of the south, the king of Judah, however, is left in place at this point as a kind of puppet king. However, a bit later, when that king, okay, Jehoiakim, when he rebels, this then begins a second deportation, okay? And then this second deportation, this king, as well as other learned and elite folks and artisans, they're taken into captivity in Babylon. This is described in 2 Kings 24, verses 10 through 16. Okay, and only, quote unquote, the poorest of the land are left, okay? So it's at this point that all the good and expensive stuff from the temple is carried away as well, okay? Although the temple is not destroyed at this point, Okay, so they kind of take all the stuff from the temple, take away more people. Okay, and they put into place, that is the Babylonians put into place another puppet king called Zedekiah. Okay, however, Zedekiah too decides to rebel. Okay, and at this point in time, after kind of this third or second rebellion, the Babylonians now destroy the palace, destroy the Temple of Solomon. Even more people are carried off. Zedekiah, we are told, is captured, brought before the king, who kills all of Zedekiah's children in front of him, then blinds him so that this is the last image that he sees, and then lock him up. Okay, and it's after this third deportation that you really get the end of the south, or Judah, or the southern kingdom. Okay, and this is really the end of ancient Israel. Okay, the year of the final deportation is 586. Okay, and at this point, with the end of the southern kingdom, you get the beginning of the exile and the exilic period. Okay, now at this point, we don't have a lot of evidence of what was going on with the community of deportees that are exiled to Babylon. Okay, however, we have some remaining evidence, right? The sadness over their exile and their kind of removal from their home country is evident in the psalm that we have, one of the more famous psalms, Psalm 137. And this is what it states. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat and there we wept when we remembered Zion. On the willows there we hung up our harps, for there our captors asked for our songs and our tormentors asked for mirth, saying, sing us one of the songs of Zion. How could we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither, let my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth, if I do not remember you, if I do not set Jerusalem above my highest joy. Okay, as evident, as soon as the Israelites are deported and exiled, they immediately start dreaming of returning to their homeland, to Israel. Okay, and this tie or connection that Israelites and later their descendants, the Jewish people, will have to this territory of Israel, I mean, it cannot be understated. There is this very long, deep connection between this people and the land. Okay, moreover, this long tradition of exile and this hope of eventual return, this cycle of exile, return, which you saw is reflected from the very beginnings of the biblical text, right? Even from the beginning of Genesis, you see exile and return, right? This will be an enduring idea, okay? And maybe some say frames the biblical text as a whole, okay? Indeed, this is not just an idea, but something that actually comes true for the Israelites, even in ancient times. As I will talk about in the next final video, okay, the Israelites do indeed get to return back to the land of Israel. It just takes about 100 years or so after the fall and destruction of Judah. But on that, please turn to the next video.